My name is Hannah, and I was 29 when I first realized that a simple cup of coffee could change everything I thought I knew about trust. It was an ordinary Sunday morning in Nashville, or at least it was supposed to be. I was sitting at my sister-in-law's elegant dining table, sunlight streaming across polished silverware, the smell of roasted bacon and baked bread filling the air. Yet in front of me, that coffee cup sat like a trap. The steam carried a sharp metallic scent that made my stomach twist. "Don't you want to try it, honey? I made this especially for you," my husband James said with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. His voice sounded calm, but something in the way he leaned forward made my pulse quicken. I stared at the dark liquid. I had tasted enough strange meals in this house to know danger could hide in something so small, so ordinary. For 3 years of marriage, I had been fighting shadows. Emergency room visits that doctors couldn't explain, sudden fevers after dinners at Nina's house, allergic reactions with no clear trigger. Every time James was there to offer excuses. Maybe it was bad seafood, maybe my stomach was too sensitive, maybe I was stressed. The explanations blurred together, but the pattern never left my mind. And now here it was again, a smile too wide, a cup of coffee that smelled nothing like coffee, and Nina sitting across the table swirling her own untouched drink with calculated patience. Her eyes fixed on me, waiting. She had always been gracious on the surface, perfect hostess, polished, career woman. But under that surface lived something sharper, colder. I had felt it in the way she brushed off my questions, the way she accidentally ruined my dress at a party, the way my food was always just a little different from everyone else's. I lifted the cup, pretending to sip. The bitterness never touched my tongue. Instead, I forced a smile that hurt my cheeks. I knew if I showed fear, they would see victory. My hands trembled slightly as I set the cup back down. Inside, my thoughts raced. Why now? Why today? My anniversary was just around the corner, and James had been spending more and more time at Nina's house under the excuse of planning a surprise. The whispered conversations that ended when I walked in. The strange texts flashing on his phone. The moments that didn't add up but kept stacking into a tower of suspicion. And now this cup of coffee that reeked of chemicals instead of comfort. I glanced at Nina again, her lips curled into a smile that was almost triumphant. "James has been practicing his brewing just for you," she said, drawing out the last 3 words like a dagger. My skin prickled. It wasn't just the coffee, it was the way they watched me like hunters cornering prey. That was when the thought hit me, not just fear, but defiance. If this really was what I suspected, then I couldn't sit here and swallow poison while they smiled. I had already been to the hospital 3 times this year. I had already spent nights doubled over in pain, listening to James reassure me that I was imagining things. Enough was enough. I stood murmuring something about needing to make a quick call. My fingers brushed the cup as I rose, memorizing its heat, its weight, as though that cup held the truth of every suspicion I had ever carried. My heart thudded against my ribs. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. For a moment, I wondered if they could hear the pounding inside me. But I also knew something else. If I walked away now, if I didn't take a stand, I might never get another chance to uncover what was happening behind these polished walls. My instincts screamed at me that this moment mattered. And that was the thought I carried as I walked past Nina's place setting, letting my fingers brush against her cup in what looked like clumsiness. Somewhere inside, I knew that one stumble might reveal everything. That was how it began. Not with shouting or confrontation, not with proof written in black and white, but with a cup of coffee, a sharp smell, and the unshakable suspicion that my husband and his sister had written me into a deadly script I had never agreed to play. I remember steadying my breath as I lingered by Nina's grand dining table. The air smelled of cinnamon rolls, bacon, and something far more sinister, the bitter tang that lingered in that swapped cup of coffee. My hands shook, but I forced them still. If I faltered now, they would sense it. James sat across from Nina, his shoulders tense, though his face tried to appear casual. Nina stirred her coffee slowly, deliberately, her eyes glinting as if she already knew how this morning would end. I slipped into her study, the door cracked just wide enough for me to keep my eyes on them. My heart hammered against my ribs, my body torn between dread and determination. Nina reached for the cup, the one that had been meant for me. She raised it, inhaled, and then sipped. Time slowed. Her throat moved as she swallowed, and I clenched the doorframe so tightly my knuckles turned white. For a moment nothing happened. Then I saw the faintest tremor in her hand. The porcelain clinked against the saucer as she set the cup down. James leaned forward, his face tightening with something between concern and fear. "Are you all right?" he asked too quickly. Nina's lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded at first, then shook her head, her face paling as another tremor rippled through her fingers. She whispered something I couldn't hear, and James's chair scraped loudly as he shot to his feet. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup," he hissed. His voice cracked. My stomach turned cold. I stepped back, pulling out my phone, the red recording light glowing like a lifeline. The evidence I had long prayed for was unfolding right in front of me. Nina's voice broke through the silence. "James, what did you put in that coffee?" Her body shook violently now, the calm veneer shattered. James stumbled toward her, his panic impossible to mask. "It was supposed to just make her sick enough to stay home next week. That's all. It wasn't meant for you." My chest tightened. The truth poured out in fragments, but it was enough to confirm everything I had feared. The hospital visits, the unexplained symptoms, the way James had always soothed me with excuses. They weren't coincidences. They were rehearsals. I dialed 911, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Yes, we need an ambulance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive. My sister-in-law is experiencing severe convulsions." I gave the details with precision, my eyes never leaving the two of them. James looked up then, and his eyes met mine. The calm mask he had worn for years shattered. Fear, guilt, and fury all collided in his expression. Nina collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, gasping, her eyes rolling back. James crouched beside her, his hands hovering uselessly, as if afraid to touch her. His words tumbled out in a rush, half apology, half excuse. "It was only supposed to... I didn't think... she wasn't supposed to drink it." And then Nina's voice rose again, weak but edged with fury. "You promised it wouldn't be traced. You promised she'd just missed the board meeting. Now look at me." Her words seared through me. The puzzle pieces locked together, the mysterious tea, the breakfast incident, every unexplained illness. They had been sabotaging me for months, timing each attack to line up with critical presentations. Nina desperate to outshine me at our competing firms. James willing to betray his wife to help his sister. I pressed my back against the study wall, my phone recording every desperate word, every broken sentence that confirmed their plan. The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, but inside the house time felt frozen, and in that moment I realized something powerful. I was not powerless anymore. I had evidence, I had the truth, and most importantly, I had a voice. Before I go deeper into what happened next, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever felt that eerie moment when your instincts screamed at you, warning you, but everyone around dismissed it as paranoia? If you have, share it in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you're following along with my story, don't forget to subscribe, because what comes next reveals just how far betrayal can go. The sirens grew louder. James pressed both hands to his face, mumbling incoherently. Nina clawed at the table leg, her breath shallow, her body trembling with violent spasms. For the first time, I felt no sympathy, only clarity. This was their plan, turned back on them by chance, or perhaps by fate. When the paramedics burst through the front door, the polished calm of Nina's perfect home cracked open like glass. Shouts, hurried instructions, the metallic clatter of medical equipment, it all blurred together. I followed as they lifted Nina onto the stretcher, my phone still recording. Her eyes met mine, wild and desperate. She whispered, "You switched." You knew. And she was right. I did know. That moment was the turning point. The day when doubt turned into proof, when whispered suspicions became a recorded confession, and when I finally understood the full danger of trusting the wrong people. When I think back on the months that led me to that moment, I realize the signs had always been there. At first, they were subtle: an upset stomach after a family dinner, a dizzy spell at a holiday brunch, a rash that appeared out of nowhere after Nina insisted on preparing me a special dish. I wanted to believe they were accidents, coincidences that life simply tossed my way. But coincidence doesn't send you to the emergency room 3 times in 6 months. Coincidence doesn't leave you doubled over in pain every time you share a meal at the same house. The first time was in February. James and I had just returned from Nina's place after a casual dinner. Within an hour, I was on the bathroom floor, clutching my stomach as if something inside me had twisted into knots. The doctors called it food poisoning, though strangely, no one else at dinner was sick. James stroked my hair and whispered, "Maybe it was something you ate earlier, babe. You always have such a sensitive stomach." At the time, I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe that my husband was my protector, not the person who might be hurting me. Then came April. Nina invited me over for tea, just the two of us. I remember her handing me the delicate porcelain cup, her smile sweet, her voice syrupy soft. "This blend is calming," she said. "You'll love it." Hours later, I was in urgent care, my body trembling, my skin clammy. The doctors couldn't explain it. James arrived shaking his head, telling me maybe I was under too much stress at work. Stress, he said, can do strange things. By June, I couldn't deny the pattern. Breakfast at their house, pancakes, eggs, bacon, everything seemed normal. But before noon, I was in the hospital again. This time, the doctors found traces of an unfamiliar substance in my system, but not enough to identify. I remember lying there, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, James holding my hand and insisting I must have taken expired medication by mistake. He said it so confidently that even I started to wonder if maybe I had. Maybe it was me. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality. But deep down, my instincts screamed otherwise. Each episode came after meals connected to Nina. Each explanation James offered was too quick, too rehearsed. The same phrases, the same soothing tone, as if he had practiced them. And the way Nina always looked at me, when I excused myself to the restroom, the slight curve of her lips, it didn't feel like concern. It felt like triumph. That's when I began keeping records. I wrote down dates, times, what I ate, how I felt, even what Nina or James said to me afterward. I thought if I kept everything documented, I might prove to myself that it wasn't paranoia. Page after page filled with the same story: dinner illness denial. Dinner illness denial. Over and over again. It became harder to ignore the tension in the air whenever I was around them. Whispered conversations cut off the moment I entered a room. Messages on James's phone that disappeared when I asked about them. Even his excuses grew thinner, weaker. He stopped looking me in the eyes. When I asked why Nina always insisted on making my plate, why she hovered so closely when I ate. By the time of that fateful brunch, I wasn't just suspicious. I was terrified. Terrified that one day the dose would be stronger. That one night I wouldn't make it to the hospital in time. And terrified most of all that the two people I should have trusted most, my husband and his sister, saw me not as family, but as an obstacle to remove. I need to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you kept doubting yourself because everyone else told you it was just your imagination? Did you eventually realize your gut had been right all along? Tell me in the comments. I really want to hear your stories. Looking back, I realized that doubt was their strongest weapon. They wanted me to believe I was fragile, overreacting, imagining things. And I almost let them convince me. But when your body collapses again and again, when your instincts scream louder with each incident, at some point, you either keep living in denial or you decide to fight back. That decision didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly like the metallic taste of that cursed coffee. It was born from the nights I spent curled on the bathroom floor, from the way Nina's eyes gleamed when I stumbled, from the way James tightened his grip on my hand, but loosened his grip on the truth. And it brought me to that moment in Nina's dining room, to the metallic scent rising from my cup, to the choice that changed everything, whether I would finally stop doubting myself and uncover what was really happening. By then I knew deep down that this wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Every time I look back, I see the same pattern playing out like scenes from a script I never agreed to act in. It wasn't one single event that convinced me something sinister was happening. It was the repetition, the way small accidents piled up until they became impossible to ignore. Take the spilled wine at my engagement party. Nina had glided across the room with a glass in hand, her smile wide and perfect. But as she leaned in to hug me, the deep red liquid splashed down the front of my cream dress. She gasped dramatically, dabbing at the stain with napkins, whispering apologies over and over. Guests rushed to comfort me, but I caught something in her expression, a flicker of satisfaction before the mask of innocence slid back into place. Then there was the family barbecue. I remember biting into a burger she had handed me and tasting something sharp, almost metallic, buried beneath the charred meat. My stomach clenched within the hour, leaving me doubled over in pain. James rubbed my back and told everyone I probably couldn't handle spicy food. Spicy food I had grown up eating chili jalapenos hot sauce. But no one questioned him. Why would they? He was the devoted husband, always ready with an answer. Even at work functions, Nina found ways to undercut me. During a networking gala, she offered to refill my drink. Minutes later, I felt woozy, my head pounding as the room spun. I excused myself early, missing an important chance to meet with potential clients. Later that night, James shook his head gently. "You're pushing yourself too hard. You need to slow down." But I wasn't the only one drinking that night. And yet, I was the only one who ended up with symptoms that mirrored every other incident. The scariest part was how easily everyone around me believed the excuses. Nina was charming, always quick with concern, always insisting she had no idea why I was unwell. James, steady and calm, repeating the same explanations until they sounded reasonable. It was like living in a play where everyone else had memorized their lines except me. I started testing little things. At family dinners, I would swap plates discreetly or pretend to take bites while actually pushing food around with my fork. On nights when I refused food altogether, I felt fine. The pattern became undeniable. Whenever I ate or drank something prepared by Nina or encouraged by James, I ended up in pain. But here's what made me feel like I was losing my mind: the moments in between. Nina sending me flowers after a hospital stay. James staying up late making tea, whispering that he hated seeing me suffer. They blurred the line between care and cruelty so perfectly that I questioned myself again and again. Were they really trying to hurt me? Or was I inventing a nightmare that didn't exist? Still, every new coincidence chipped away at the doubt. The cup of tea in April, the breakfast in June, the barbecue, the gala, the stains, the excuses, the lingering looks. One incident could be dismissed. But when you stack them together, a different picture appears. A picture of intent. That's when I realized the danger wasn't just physical, it was psychological. They wanted me to second-guess myself, to accept their narrative instead of my own instincts. Because if I doubted my reality long enough, I would eventually stop resisting. I would drink whatever they placed in front of me, smile when they smiled, and let them decide my fate. I refused to let that happen, so I started documenting everything, every date, every symptom, every word James or Nina used to explain it away. My journal became my lifeline, proof that I wasn't imagining this, that my body wasn't betraying me, people were. And yet keeping records didn't ease the dread. If anything, it deepened it. Because every page of that journal reminded me that the pattern was building toward something bigger. That sooner or later, the mild doses would escalate. That I might not make it to the hospital in time. So, I see now that the spilled wine, the spiced burger, the strange tea, those were rehearsals. Small steps meant to test the boundaries of what they could get away with. They were sharpening their method, perfecting their cover stories, waiting for the right moment to deliver the final act. And that act came in the form of a single cup of coffee on a bright Sunday morning in Nashville. That morning in Nina's dining room, something inside me finally snapped into place. For months, I had been circling shadows, doubting myself, trying to reconcile the contradictions of love and betrayal. But when the sharp, metallic scent of that coffee reached my nose, every memory aligned like pieces of a cruel puzzle. I glanced at James, who was watching me too closely, and then at Nina, whose smile curved a little too perfectly as she stirred her untouched cup. It wasn't just the smell that unsettled me, it was the way they moved in sync, the way their eyes flicked toward one another, as if sharing a private joke. Suddenly, every accident I had endured, the spilled wine, the tainted breakfast, the woozy gala felt less like bad luck and more like rehearsed scenes in a play I hadn't agreed to perform. And for the first time, I admitted the thought I had buried for months they were trying to poison me. It was a chilling realization. I had built a life with James, a marriage that once seemed steady. I had welcomed Nina as family, even trusted her advice when planning my wedding. Now sitting at her table, I felt like prey caught in a carefully laid snare. As my fingers wrapped around the warm porcelain, I forced myself to smile. My heart pounded so loudly I feared they could hear it echoing across the table. But I kept my expression calm, because if I showed fear, if I faltered for even a second, they would know I had figured it out. And if they knew, I wasn't sure I'd leave that house alive. The memory of April's tea came rushing back, the strange bitterness on my tongue, the trembling in my limbs, hours later. Nina's sweet voice insisting she had brewed the tea the same way she always did. Then June's breakfast when the doctors found traces of something they couldn't identify. And all those nights lying on cold hospital beds, James sitting beside me whispering reassurances while I writhed in pain. His voice had always been steady, but now I saw it for what it was, performance. I tightened my grip on the cup, lowering it without letting a drop touch my lips. I looked down at the swirling liquid and thought, this is their weapon. This is how they've been breaking me piece by piece. And now they've decided it's time to finish the job. At that moment, a strange calm washed over me. Fear still knotted my stomach, but clarity sharpened my mind. They believed I was blind, naive, too, trusting, but they had underestimated me. I leaned back slightly, pretending to check my phone. My thoughts were racing, but my face betrayed nothing. I had one chance to outmaneuver them. And if I played it right, this cup of coffee might not end my life, it might finally expose theirs. Looking across the table at Nina, I caught her smirk. James has become quite the barista, she said lightly. He's been practicing different brewing methods just for you. Her words dripped with mockery. My pulse quickened, but outwardly I let out a soft laugh. Inside, I made a silent vow I would not let them win. Before I reveal the next move I made, let me pause and tell you this. If you're listening right now, don't underestimate your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And if you've ever had to smile through suspicion just to protect yourself, share your story in the comments. I promise you, I read every single one. And if you want to keep hearing stories like mine, where survival depends on trusting your gut, hit subscribe. It means more than you know. The smell of coffee lingered bitter and poisonous, but I no longer felt powerless. For the first time in months, I held an advantage. I knew what they were trying to do, and I knew I couldn't drink from that cup. So I stood up, murmuring something about needing to make a quick call for work. My chair scraped lightly against the polished floor. Nina arched an eyebrow but said nothing. James kept his eyes on the cup in front of me, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. I walked past Nina's place, setting my heart thudding. And in that second, as my hand brushed the edge of the table, I stumbled deliberately, just clumsy enough to look believable. My hand darted forward, steadying myself against her saucer and switching our cups in the same motion. It happened so quickly neither of them noticed. I straightened, murmured an apology, and slipped into the study. My palms were damp, my body trembling with adrenaline, but my mind was clear. Now it was only a matter of time. That was the moment my suspicions transformed into certainty. The metallic smell, the smirks, the whispers, they weren't paranoia. They were proof. And soon, that proof would reveal itself in the most terrifying way possible. In the silence of Nina's study, I pressed my back against the wall and tried to calm the storm inside me. My breath came fast, shallow, each inhale heavy, with the scent of polished wood and old books. Through the doorway I had left slightly ajar, I could still see the dining room table, its glittering glassware, its untouched pastries, and the cup now sitting in front of Nina, the cup that was supposed to be mine. My hands trembled as I clutched my phone, the red light of the recording app blinking steadily. It felt like the only anchor keeping me from unraveling. I had spent months documenting my suspicions in writing, but now I was about to capture the truth in real time. Nina raised the cup to her lips. My pulse roared in my ears. For a split second, I wanted to shout to stop her before the liquid touched her tongue. But the memory of emergency rooms and whispered excuses hardened my resolve. I needed to know. I needed the proof. She sipped, swallowed, and for a few long seconds nothing happened. James glanced at her, his expression tight, but then forced a smile as if reassuring himself. I gripped the doorframe harder, nails digging into the wood. Then it came. A flicker, just the faintest tremor in Nina's fingers as she set the cup down. Porcelain clinked against porcelain too loud in the hushed dining room. Her face paled, the smirk sliding away like paint washed off by rain. "James." Her voice was thin, wavering. She pressed a hand to her stomach. "Something's wrong." James's chair scraped violently as he shot to his feet. His mask of calm cracked panic flashing across his features. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup," he hissed, his words sharp, desperate. "Oh God, Nina, that wasn't supposed to be your cup." My stomach clenched. Every suspicion I had carried for months materialized in those words. He had admitted it. Not directly, but enough. Enough to confirm what I already knew. Nina's body shuddered, her hand knocking over a spoon as she struggled to steady herself. "What did you put in it, James?" Her eyes burned with accusation and fear. He knelt beside her, his hands fluttering uselessly as she convulsed. "It was just supposed to make her sick for a day," he muttered, voice cracking. "That's all? Just sick enough to miss the meeting?" The words sliced through me. The meeting, my presentation for the Henderson account. The one I had been preparing for weeks, the one that could determine the future of my career. They had targeted me not just out of cruelty, but out of greed, jealousy, ambition. I tightened my grip on my phone, making sure the recording captured every sound, the clatter of the chair, James's frantic whispers, Nina's trembling voice. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I might collapse, but there was a strange steadiness inside me too. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't paranoid. This was real. Nina's voice broke again, laced with fury, despite the spasms racking her body. "You promised. You said it wouldn't be traced." James's eyes widened, as if realizing how damning her words were. He glanced toward my empty chair, then toward the hallway. "Christina," he called softly, his voice trembling. "Where are you?" I didn't answer. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows of the study, recording everything. If I stepped out too soon, they might find a way to spin this to silence me. But if I stayed hidden just a few minutes longer, I would have undeniable evidence. The sound of Nina collapsing fully onto the hardwood floor jolted me. James cursed under his breath, fumbling for his phone. "I'll call an ambulance," he muttered, though his shaking hands betrayed him. I raised my own phone to my ear, dialing 911. My voice was calm, almost too calm, as I spoke to the dispatcher. "We need an ambulance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive. My sister-in-law is convulsing after drinking coffee." "Yes, she's conscious but deteriorating quickly." Behind me, my reflection in the study's glass cabinet caught my eye, pale, determined, unrecognizable. I was no longer the woman who doubted her instincts, who second-guessed every suspicion. I was the woman who had finally taken control. James knelt on the floor, his whispers frantic. "It was supposed to be her, not you, not you." His words, though meant for Nina, echoed into the room like a confession. I steadied myself, stepping forward just enough to see their faces clearly. Nina's gaze found mine raw with fear. She gasped, her voice breaking. You switched. You knew. And in that moment, she was right. I did know. I held the phone tighter, recording every desperate sound, every broken sentence. The proof I had been chasing was finally mine. But even as sirens wailed in the distance, I couldn't shake the icy truth their plan hadn't ended with one cup of coffee. It had been building for months, escalating. And if I hadn't acted today, I might not have lived to see tomorrow. The sound of Nina's body hitting the polished hardwood echoed through the dining room like a final verdict. Her fork clattered to the floor, her breath ragged as violent tremors racked her frame. For months, I had been the one collapsing, the one gasping for air in hospital rooms. But now, for the first time, she was the one on the floor, and James's mask of control shattered instantly. He scrambled beside her, his face drained of color. Nina, stay with me, he begged, his voice trembling. His hands hovered in the air, unsure whether to touch her or recoil from what he had caused. It wasn't supposed to be you. It wasn't supposed to be you. The words tumbled out desperate and damning. I stepped just far enough into the doorway to watch my phone lifted, the recording still running. Every word from his mouth was another nail in their coffin. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was unraveling. Nina clawed at his sleeve, her voice a hoarse whisper between spasms. You promised. You said it would only make her sick, just enough to keep her home. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, now rolled with fear and fury. James shook his head violently, gripping his hair with both hands. You don't understand. She switched the cups. This wasn't supposed to happen. His eyes darted toward my empty chair, panic spreading across his face. He knew. He realized what I had done. I stepped into the light, my voice steady, though my hands trembled. You mean it wasn't supposed to happen to Nina? It was supposed to happen to me. The silence that followed was deafening. James froze, his mouth opening, but no words forming. Nina's gaze locked onto mine, wide with the terror of someone who knew the game was over. Sirens wailed closer now, their cries cutting through the tense air. James stumbled to his feet, backing toward the wall as if distance could undo the truth. Christina, listen to me. You don't know what you think you know. This isn't what it looks like. But I had the recording. I had his words, Nina's gasping confessions, and the living proof of her body convulsing on the floor. And for once, I felt no need to argue. The evidence was speaking louder than I ever could. Nina groaned, clutching her stomach, her anger briefly flaring. This is your fault, James. You said it was safe. You said it wouldn't be traced. Her voice cracked raw, but it carried across the room like a hammer striking glass. James lunged toward her, gripping her shoulders, hissing through clenched teeth. Stop talking. For God's sake, stop talking. But it was too late. Every damning word was captured, etched into the device in my hand. The door burst open as paramedics rushed inside. Their shouts filled the room, she seizing. Get the stretcher, and I stepped aside, calm in a way that felt almost unnatural. For once, I wasn't the victim. I was the witness. I was the one holding the truth. James tried to follow the medics as they lifted Nina, but I blocked his path. My voice was sharp, controlled. You'll get your chance to explain at the hospital and to the police. His face twisted, rage and fear colliding, but he said nothing. He couldn't. As the stretcher rolled past me, Nina's trembling hand gripped the side rail. Her eyes locked on mine, filled with a mixture of hatred and dread. She whispered, barely audible, You knew. You switched. And she was right. I had trusted my instincts for the first time in months, and it had saved me. Before I move further, I need to ask you something. If you were in my place, if you saw the people you trusted most unravel in front of you, would you step forward and expose them, or would you freeze? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear how you think you would handle that moment. The paramedics wheeled her out, their voices urgent, their equipment clattering. James stood frozen, his chest heaving, his hands shaking at his sides. His carefully constructed mask had cracked, and there was no putting it back together. The shrill wail of sirens faded into the distance as the ambulance sped away. I lifted my phone, saving the recording to my private email, backing it up to a folder only I could access. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was justice. James's voice broke the silence, low and broken. You don't understand, Christina. We were only trying to protect you. Protect me. The words nearly made me laugh bitter and cold. Poison wasn't protection. Lies weren't love. And betrayal wasn't family. That was the moment everything shifted. The hunter had become the prey. The game they thought they controlled was slipping out of their hands, and for the first time I was the one dictating the terms. The ambulance lights painted the street outside in red and blue flashes as Nina's body was rushed away. But her words lingered in the air like smoke, sharp, acrid, impossible to escape. Even through the chaos, I heard her voice, as clearly as if she were still beside me. You promised it would only make her sick. Just enough to keep her home. The weight of those words sank into me like ice. It wasn't random. It wasn't some cruel joke or twisted experiment. It was strategy. They hadn't just been trying to weaken me, they had been trying to control my career. James stood in the doorway, staring after the stretcher, his shoulders slumped as though the fight had already drained out of him. But when I caught his eye, the mask slipped again. Christina, you're overreacting, he muttered, his voice hoarse. Nina didn't mean she wasn't thinking straight, but I had heard enough. My voice was cold, steady. She meant every word. This was about the Henderson account, wasn't it? His face blanched. He didn't answer, but the silence said more than his denial ever could. And then, like fate itself, Nina's voice broke through again, muffled but audible from the stretcher, as the paramedics guided her down the steps. The tea, that was supposed to keep you home during the Johnson presentation, she gasped. But you went anyway. You ruined everything. The Johnson presentation. Suddenly, the months of pain, the perfectly timed illnesses, the endless excuses all snapped into alignment. Each episode had fallen just before critical meetings or client pitches. Each incident had struck when my success was poised to eclipse hers. Nina's eyes had always burned with competition, but I had convinced myself it was harmless rivalry. I was wrong. She hadn't been competing, she had been sabotaging me. James rushed forward as if to muffle her words, but I stepped between them. No. Let her talk, I demanded. For once, let the truth come out. Nina's body convulsed again, her voice slurring with exhaustion, but the venom in her words remained. We planned it for months. Every time she outperformed me. Every client she stole. You said we'd fix it. She turned her face toward James, eyes wild. You said today would end it. You promised. The paramedics urged silence, telling her to save her strength, but it was too late. The confession spilled like poison, raw and undeniable. My hands trembled, but my voice stayed steady as I held up my phone. It's all recorded, I told James. Every word. His face twisted with something between rage and fear. You don't understand, he snapped, stepping closer. You were working yourself to death. We were just trying to slow you down, give you a break. My laugh was bitter hollow. By poisoning me, by sending me to the ER again and again. That's not protection, James. That's betrayal. He reached out desperate, but I stepped back. For the first time in our marriage, I felt no obligation to soften the truth for him. My love had blinded me long enough. Nina groaned again from the stretcher, her fury cutting through her weakness. You were supposed to drink it, Christina. You were supposed to miss the Henderson presentation. That account is mine. And there it was, the heart of it all. Henderson wasn't just a client. It was a multi-million-dollar deal, a career-defining opportunity. We worked at competing firms, and she couldn't bear to watch me win. To her, my success wasn't just threatening, it was unforgivable. The sirens wailed louder as the ambulance pulled away. I stood in the driveway, clutching my phone, watching as James collapsed onto the steps, his head in his hands. The perfect image of a husband and sister working together had finally shattered. And in its place stood the ugly truth. They had plotted not only to ruin my career, but to ruin me entirely. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If someone you trusted, family, spouse, both confessed they had been sabotaging you for months, would you forgive them, or would you walk away forever? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to know how you see it. I turned to James one last time. Every time I was lying in a hospital bed, you were standing there feeding me lies. And all along it was you, both of you. And now I finally have proof. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of his silence was heavier than any words. That night wasn't just about betrayal, it was revelation. Every tremor, every whispered excuse, every glance they shared across a table now carried its true meaning. It wasn't paranoia, it was a plan. And their own words had exposed it. The ambulance had carried Nina away, her words still echoing like cracks of thunder in my mind. I stood there on the driveway, my phone clutched so tightly it might have fused with my hand. Every confession, every frantic plea, every poisonous slip of the tongue, it was all safely captured in the glowing red circle on my screen. For months, I had been treated like a paranoid wife, dismissed as fragile, accused of imagining things. But now I had proof. I replayed a fragment of the recording just enough to hear James's broken whisper. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup." The sound made my blood run cold, but also sent a fierce jolt of power through me. I wasn't helpless anymore. The truth wasn't just in my head, it was in my hands. Inside, James slumped at the table, his face buried in his palms. He looked up when I stepped back into the dining room, and for a split second, I almost saw the man I married, the one who once swore to protect me. But then his eyes flickered with calculation, and the illusion shattered. "Christina," he said softly, "delete it, please. This will ruin everything." I let out a bitter laugh. "Everything, James, you and Nina already ruined everything." I held the phone higher. "This recording goes to my lawyer, to the police, to anyone who needs to hear it. You can't lie your way out of this." His face twisted, anger replacing desperation. "You don't know what you're doing, Henderson. That account is worth millions. Do you think your career survives? If you drag this into court, you'll go down with us." But I didn't flinch. For the first time in years, I felt steady. "The only thing going down is your little scheme. You thought I wouldn't see it, that I'd keep doubting myself until I collapsed for good. But you underestimated me." My phone buzzed in my hand, the dispatcher still on the line, asking me to stay connected until officers arrived. I gave them the details calmly, my voice steady, almost detached. I told them what Nina had drunk, what James had admitted, what I had captured. James muttered curses under his breath, pacing the length of the dining room like a trapped animal. Through the window, I could see the distant glow of patrol cars cutting through the Nashville streets. The cavalry was on its way, and James knew it. He stopped pacing his chest, heaving, his eyes locked on the phone in my hand. "If you love me," he started. But I cut him off. "No, James. Love doesn't look like poison in my coffee." The wail of sirens drew closer, and a strange calm settled over me. For months, my world had been chaos, hospital visits, confusion, lies. But now, with flashing blue lights cutting into the night, everything felt clear. I stepped outside just as two officers pulled into the driveway. I raised my hand phone, still recording, and met their gaze with a steadiness I didn't know I had. "He confessed," I said. "It's all here." They took the phone, backing it up immediately, securing it as evidence. Behind me, James's voice rose in panic. "Wait. You don't understand, we were just trying to help her. Just trying to slow her down." But the officers didn't listen. His words no longer mattered. The recording spoke louder. And as James was led away, I finally let myself exhale. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe without fear of what was hidden in the air. Before I take you into what happened at the hospital, the confrontations, the toxicology results, the unraveling of every secret, I need to pause. Because this is where the story shifts from suspicion to revelation, from whispers to undeniable evidence. If you followed me this far, don't go anywhere. What came next was darker, louder, and more dangerous than anything I could have imagined. Stay with me. The truth was only just beginning to surface. That night, as the officers secured James and I handed over the recording, I realized something chilling. Their plan hadn't ended here. It had only been interrupted. And what I would learn at the hospital would tear apart whatever fragments of family I thought I still had. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear. I walked down the white-walled corridor, my shoes clicking against the linoleum, my phone clutched in my hand like a weapon. Somewhere ahead, Nina lay in a room under bright fluorescent lights, hooked up to monitors that beeped steadily, betraying the chaos her body had endured. James had been taken aside by security, his face pale, his voice stumbling through excuses. And me? I was no longer the frightened woman who doubted her own sanity. I was the witness, the record keeper, the survivor. A nurse approached her, expression grave. "Are you family?" she asked. "I'm her sister-in-law," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. She nodded. "The doctors stabilized her, but her blood work is alarming. They've found compounds that shouldn't be there, compounds that point to deliberate tampering." Her words didn't shock me. They confirmed everything I already knew. Still hearing them aloud was like being struck with cold water. I followed her into the room where Dr. Phillips, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, stood at the foot of Nina's bed. She turned toward me. "Mrs. Bennett," she said firmly before we continue, "I need to know exactly what happened at brunch today." I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my phone, opened the recording, and pressed play. James's voice filled the sterile air, panicked, desperate. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup." Nina's slurred confession followed, raw and unmistakable. "You promised." Just enough to keep her home for Henderson. The doctor's eyes hardened as she listened, tapping notes into her tablet. When the recording ended, she let out a slow breath. "This is serious. Very serious. The substance we found isn't something you encounter by accident. It was introduced deliberately." I nodded, my grip tightening on the phone. "This wasn't the first time. I've been hospitalized 3 times in the last 6 months, each time after eating or drinking something from their house. The symptoms varied, but the pattern never changed." Dr. Phillips tilted her head. "Do you have documentation?" "Yes." I reached into my bag and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with dates, times, meals, symptoms. Every entry was written in neat, desperate detail. February dinner, severe stomach pains. April tea, tremors, dizziness. June breakfast, hospitalization, unidentified substance. Each note carried the memory of hours spent curled in agony, wondering if I was losing my mind. The doctor scanned the notes, her jaw tightening. These symptoms align disturbingly well with what we found in Nina's system today. This suggests a pattern, a deliberate escalation over time. Behind us, the door opened. James appeared, flanked by 2 security guards. His face was pale sweat glistening at his temple. "Christina," he pleaded, taking a step toward me, "listen to me. This isn't what you think." Nina was confused. She didn't know what she was saying. I turned, lifting another phone from my purse, the backup I had used for months. With a single tap, his own damning words filled the room. "I've got something stronger this time. She won't make it to the presentation." James froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Dr. Phillips raised a hand, her voice sharp. "Security, keep him here until the police arrive." As the guards tightened their hold on his arms, I felt a strange calm. Months of gaslighting, months of whispered doubts and trembling fears, and now the truth stood exposed under the harsh lights of Nashville General Hospital. I stepped closer to the doctor, lowering my voice. "Will the toxicology reports match what's in my system from the last hospital visits?" Her eyes narrowed. "We'll run comparisons. But based on your notes and what we've already found, I have no doubt they will." James's voice cracked, desperation leaking through. "We weren't trying to kill you. We just needed you out of the way. You're working yourself too hard, Christina. We wanted to protect you." My laugh was sharp, bitter. "Protect me by poisoning me, by making me doubt my own sanity. That's not protection, that's attempted murder." Before I continue, let me turn the question to you. If someone you loved, someone you shared your home and your heart with, looked you in the eye and said they had poisoned you for your own good, what would you do? Would you forgive or would you fight? Tell me in the comments, because I need to know how others see this. The beeping monitors filled the silence as James sagged in the guard's grip. Behind him, Nina stirred weakly, her eyes flicking open, her once confident demeanor crumbling under the weight of exposure. I looked at both of them, then at Dr. Phillips. I've had enough of their lies. I'm ready to give my full statement. That night at the hospital wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming my voice, putting an end to the cycle of doubt and deception. For the first time, I wasn't the one in the hospital bed. I was the one standing, holding the truth like a sword. The next 48 hours unfolded like a storm, each hour tearing away another layer of the life I thought I knew. After Dr. Phillips confirmed that Nina's blood work showed dangerous levels of toxins, Detective Mendoza arrived. She was sharp-eyed calm and carried the air of someone who had seen every shade of betrayal before. She listened to my statement, replayed my recordings, studied my notebook, and then made the decision that shifted the case from suspicion to criminal certainty. "We're executing a warrant on both of their offices and homes," she said, her voice steady, but edged with steel. "If they were running this long-term, we'll find evidence of preparation, not just execution." I should have felt relieved, but as I sat in that hospital waiting room, the air thick with disinfectant and muted footsteps, I felt something else too, terror at what we might discover. Because part of me still clung to the hope that this had been a nightmare, an isolated moment of weakness. But deep down, I already knew better. 2 days later, the evidence arrived like a hammer. Detective Mendoza called me to the precinct. On the table in front of her sat several clear evidence bags. Inside were small amber glass bottles with white clinical labels, the kind you'd expect to see in a pharmaceutical lab, not in the desk drawer of an account manager. Alongside them lay notebooks, scribbled with dates, doses, and reactions. My name appeared over and over next to cold clinical notations: mild nausea insufficient, dizziness 2 hours, hospitalization progressing. I felt the air leave my lungs. My knees nearly buckled, and I gripped the back of a chair just to stay upright. "They were documenting me," I whispered, "like an experiment." The detective's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, then hardened again. "Yes. And it shows escalation. They started small, but the notes indicate they were increasing doses over time. This wasn't clumsy sabotage, it was systematic." I stared at the bottles. My mind flashed back to the bitter taste in the burger at the barbecue, the wooziness after the gala, the nights I spent curled on the bathroom floor. They hadn't just been trying to sideline me, they had been testing me, calibrating the poison, like scientists adjusting formulas. The betrayal cut deeper than any hospital needle. James hadn't only betrayed me as a husband, he had stripped away my humanity, turning me into a subject, a case study, a line in a journal. When James was confronted with the evidence, he broke. Sitting in the interrogation room, he tried to frame it as Nina's obsession. "She pushed me," he said, his voice cracking. "I never wanted to go this far. I just wanted her to slow down. She was outshining everyone. Nina said if we could just keep her out of work for a few days, it would help." But the notebooks told the truth. His handwriting was there. His initials marked the margins. And even as he tried to push the blame onto Nina, the evidence tied them together like shackles. Detective Mendoza turned the notes toward me. "These matched the hospital visits you logged. Same dates, same symptoms. They weren't hiding what they did. They were tracking it." My throat burned. Rage and sorrow swirled in me until I couldn't separate them. "They didn't just want to sabotage me," I said slowly. "They wanted to erase me, to make me disappear from my own career, my own life." The detective didn't argue. She didn't need to. The bottles and journals said enough. Later that night, I sat alone in my car outside the precinct, staring at the city lights of Nashville. My phone buzzed with messages, friends checking in, colleagues asking why I had missed the last few days of work, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. All I could think about was the neat handwriting that reduced me to a series of reaction side effects outcomes. For months they had made me doubt myself, but now I held the truth in my hands, and it was darker than even I had imagined. Before I tell you what happened when the case went to court, let me ask if you discovered journals where your loved ones tracked your suffering like a science experiment. How would you react? Would you burn with rage, or would you collapse under the weight of it? Share your thoughts. I wonder if anyone can truly imagine that moment until they live it. I took a deep breath, starting my car, knowing the fight wasn't over. The courtroom would be the battlefield, and this time I wouldn't be the one left trembling. That discovery, the bottles, the notes, wasn't just evidence. It was the final betrayal. Proof that my life had been reduced to data points in a scheme to destroy me. And it was only the beginning of their downfall. When the detectives laid out all the evidence in front of me, the picture became painfully clear. The bottles, the clinical notes, the recordings, all of it pointed to one truth I had resisted admitting for far too long. This wasn't about random cruelty or some twisted hobby. It was about ambition. It was about power. It was about Nina's insatiable need to win no matter the cost. The Henderson account had been the crown jewel of our industry that year. Every firm wanted it. Landing Henderson meant prestige promotions and millions of dollars in contracts. And Henderson's executives had requested me by name. They wanted me leading the pitch, guiding the negotiations, shaping the campaign. To Nina, that must have been unbearable. She had spent years building her portfolio, clawing her way into boardrooms. Then suddenly I appeared, and clients trusted me more than they trusted her. Jealousy is a quiet poison. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, dripping into someone's mind until they can't hear anything else. I think that's what happened to Nina. She didn't just envy me. She convinced herself that I had stolen something from her, that my success was somehow an attack on her identity. And James, my husband, fed into that delusion. Maybe because he wanted to protect her. Maybe because he wanted to control me. Maybe because he couldn't bear the thought of standing beside a wife who was more successful than he was. Detective Mendoza spelled it out in plain words. They weren't just sabotaging you, they were eliminating competition. This was corporate warfare carried into your home. It was like a knife twisting in my gut. My marriage vows, the Sunday family dinners, the laughter at birthdays, they hadn't been real. They were camouflage for a plot driven by envy and greed. The sickest part. Reading through the notes, I saw how strategic they had been. Each incident aligned with a critical moment. The Johnson pitch, the quarterly review, the Henderson preparation. They weren't trying to kill me outright at first. They were testing limits, ensuring I'd be too weak to stand in the spotlight when it mattered most. Nina's handwriting appeared beside James's, both of them, complicit, both of them calculating. I stared at one line over and over again, increased dosage before Henderson critical. Even now I can hear my own breath catching when I read it. They didn't want me sidelined anymore. They wanted me gone. The irony burned in me. They thought destroying me would elevate them. But in truth, it revealed just how small they were, how fragile their own talent must have been if my presence threatened it so deeply. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through copies of the evidence, I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about anyone who has ever been targeted because they dared to succeed. About anyone who has ever had their light dimmed because it made someone else uncomfortable. And I knew I couldn't just survive this. I had to expose it. Before I reveal what happened in the courtroom, how their empire of lies collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance, let me leave you with this thought. Have you ever felt someone's envy so strongly that it changed the way they treated you? That it turned love into bitterness, friendship, into rivalry, family, into betrayal? Hold on to that thought, because what happened next shows just how far envy can twist a person's soul. The Henderson account became more than a business deal. It became the battlefield where Nina and James declared war on me. And though they thought they could bury me under lies and poison, they forgot one thing: I wasn't fighting alone anymore. I had the truth. The stage was set. The evidence was ready. And as the trial began, every secret they had hidden in shadows was dragged into the light for all to see. The courthouse in downtown Nashville was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, though the marble floors and high ceilings always seemed to trap a chill, but in spirit. As I sat in the front row of the gallery, I felt every eye on me, but my gaze never left the two defendants seated just a few feet away. James, the man I once trusted with my life, and Nina, the sister-in-law I had once admired. Now shackled by evidence and stripped of charm, they looked small in their chairs, dwarfed by the weight of what they had done. The trial stretched over 3 weeks. Every morning I walked through those courthouse doors with my head high, though my stomach knotted with dread. The prosecution began with the recordings, James's panicked confession, Nina's slurred admissions, their desperate words captured on my phone. Hearing their voices echo through the courtroom was like reliving the worst days of my life, but this time, the truth was undeniable. Then came the journals. The prosecutor held them up for the jury, reading aloud the chilling notations: mild nausea dose too low, hospitalized progressing as planned. My name scrawled across pages like a case file, my suffering reduced to experiments. The jurors' faces tightened as the weight of those words sank in. Some shook their heads, others leaned forward as though trying to comprehend how a husband and sister could turn meals into weapons. The toxicology experts followed their testimony clinical precise. They explained how the compounds worked in the body, how the dosages escalated, how the final concentration in that poisoned coffee could have been fatal. One doctor turned toward the jury and said flatly, "If Mrs. Bennet had consumed the entire cup, she likely would not be here today." A murmur rippled through the room, and I felt my throat tighten. But perhaps the most damning moment came when the pharmaceutical company's representative took the stand. He confirmed that the substances had been stolen by a former colleague of James, smuggled out of testing labs, and passed along. It connected the chain, perfectly access intent execution. James sat stone-faced during much of the testimony, his eyes fixed on the table. But every so often his hand twitched, his jaw clenched, betraying the fear underneath. Nina, once polished and confident, now looked gaunt, her eyes darting nervously whenever evidence tied her name directly to the scheme. The defense tried, of course. They painted Nina as overworked, James as desperate to protect me from stress. They argued the doses were never meant to kill, only to incapacitate. But each time the prosecution countered with cold, hard facts. If it was protection, the prosecutor said in her closing argument, why did they hide the bottles? Why did they track her symptoms like lab rats? Why did they escalate the doses until the line between illness and death blurred? The silence that followed spoke louder than any rebuttal. I sat through it all, my notebook on my lap, my pen steady in my hand. For months I had been silenced by doubt, gaslighted into believing my instincts were paranoia. But in that courtroom, my voice returned. Each time I was called to the stand, I spoke clearly, calmly, recounting the hospital visits, the conversations, the looks that haunted me. I made sure the jury saw me not as a victim, but as someone who refused to be erased. On the last day of testimony, I glanced at the jurors as they filed out to deliberate. Some carried the same look I had seen in my friend's eyes months earlier, the disbelief that such betrayal could happen inside a marriage, inside a family. But now, disbelief had turned to certainty, and as I waited for the verdict, I thought about all the people watching this story unfold, colleagues, neighbors, strangers reading headlines. I thought about how many of them had felt silenced by doubt, how many had questioned their own reality because someone close to them insisted they were imagining things. That's why I need to say this. If you've ever felt that knot in your stomach, that whisper in your mind, telling you something is wrong, trust it. Share this story, subscribe if you haven't, and join this community. Because no one should face betrayal alone. We learn from each other's scars, and your voice matters here. When the jury finally returned, the air in the courtroom tightened like a held breath. The foreman stood the verdict in his hands. I closed my eyes, bracing for the words that would seal their fate, and in a way mine too. What? The judge's gavel echoed, the verdict rang out, and I knew life would never return to what it had been. But it would at last be mine again. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces solemn, their eyes heavy with the burden of what they had just decided. I sat with my hands clasped in my lap knuckles, white, every muscle in my body tense. 3 weeks of testimony, 3 weeks of reliving every betrayal, every hospital visit, every whispered excuse. It all came down to this. The foreman stood holding the folded slip of paper like it carried the weight of the world. The clerk accepted it, passed it to the judge, and then silence descended on the room. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear the words at first. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendants guilty. The air left my lungs in a rush. The words echoed in my ears, sharp and final. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendants guilty. Gasps rippled through the gallery. I looked across the aisle at James and Nina. James stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, his once practiced calm utterly gone. Nina sat frozen, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, her composure shattered. The judge's voice rang out firm and unyielding. The evidence presented shows a calculated, premeditated pattern of behavior. This court cannot ignore the danger posed by such actions. Attempted murder of a spouse conspiracy carried out with a sibling, it is a betrayal of family, of trust, and of the law itself. The maximum sentence is not only justified, it is necessary. I held my breath as the gavel came down. James Bennett and Nina Anderson, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under law. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, whispers filled the air, but I sat perfectly still. Relief washed over me, but it wasn't triumph. There was no joy in seeing them led away in handcuffs, their lives unraveling in chains. It felt more like release, like I had been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. James lifted his head as the guards took his arms. For one fleeting second, our eyes met. Once that gaze had promised love, partnership, safety. Now it carried nothing but desperation. His lips moved as though he wanted to say something, an apology, a plea I'll never know, but the guards pushed him forward before the words could escape. Nina, on the other hand, didn't look at me at all. Her eyes stayed fixed on some distant point, as though refusing to acknowledge the woman she had tried so hard to erase. The woman who had survived. As they were let out, I thought about everything they had sacrificed, their careers, their reputations, their freedom, all for envy and greed. They had plotted for months, risking everything, and in the end they had destroyed only themselves. When the courtroom emptied, I stayed seated for a while. The echoes of the gavel still rang in my ears, mingling with the faint memory of coffee's metallic scent. I thought about how close I had come to drinking from that cup, how close I had come to disappearing quietly into a grave of mysterious illnesses. But I hadn't, because I had trusted myself. Later that evening, I stood outside the courthouse steps as cameras flashed and microphones thrust forward. I gave no statement, no triumphant speech. I simply said justice was served and walked away. It wasn't victory I sought, it was peace. That night I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the city lights. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. For the first time in months, I could breathe without fear of what lingered in the air, without suspicion of what sat on my plate. I realized then that betrayal doesn't end with a verdict. It leaves scars invisible but deep. But scars are proof of survival, proof that you endured. And as I closed my notebook for the last time, I whispered to myself, they tried to destroy me, but I'm still here. So, the trial was over, but my story wasn't. What came after was not just about surviving betrayal, it was about reclaiming the life they tried to steal. 1 year later, I stood behind a podium staring out at a sea of faces. The ballroom was filled with Nashville's top executives, young professionals, eager for guidance, and reporters waiting to capture every word. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was exactly the kind of opportunity Nina had tried to strip away from me. The Henderson account, once the spark of her envy, had led to a cascade of successes. My name had become synonymous with reliability, creativity, and resilience. I gripped the edges of the podium, my voice steady, amplified across the room. Success isn't just about talent or hard work, I began. It's about integrity. It's about building relationships rooted in trust. And sometimes the greatest threats don't come from competitors. Across the street, they come from those seated at your own dinner table. The crowd hushed. I could feel the weight of their attention, the way every eye locked on me, every ear tuned in. 1 year ago, I nearly lost everything, not because of lack of skill, not because of poor performance, but because people I trusted most decided that my success was unacceptable. I paused, letting the words settle. Then I smiled, not bitter, but resolute. But here's the truth. Betrayal doesn't get the final word. Surviving betrayal, rising above it, that's where true success is forged. Applause broke out strong and steady, filling the ballroom with sound. For months, I had been defined by whispers, by hospital beds, and courtroom testimonies. Now I was defined by survival, by strength, by the fact that I refused to let their poison define me. After the keynote, a young woman approached me, her hands trembling as she clutched a notepad. "How did you do it?" she asked softly. "How did you keep going when it felt like the people closest to you were pulling you down?" I looked at her, seeing a reflection of myself in her nervous eyes. "I focused on what I could control," I said. "I documented everything. I trusted my instincts even when others told me I was imagining things. And most of all, I refused to let fear make me small." Her eyes welled up and she whispered, "Thank you." That moment meant more than any applause, because it proved that my story wasn't just about me. It was about anyone who had ever been silenced, doubted, or betrayed. Later that night, as I returned home, an email pinged in my inbox. Henderson had renewed their contract for another 3 years. I sat back in my chair staring at the message, a smile spreading across my face. A year ago, I had been fighting for my life. Now, I was thriving in the career they had tried so hard to steal from me. Before I close this chapter, let me ask you one last thing. Have you ever turned pain into power, betrayal into strength? Share your story, because this community is built on survival and resilience. And if you want to hear more stories where darkness tries to win, but light breaks through, subscribe and watch the next video. It might be exactly the reminder you need today. Agree. As I shut my laptop, I thought about the newspaper I hadn't bothered to read that morning. It carried a short article about James and Nina beginning their prison sentences, but I didn't need to see it. My focus wasn't on their downfall, it was on my future, because the best revenge is not destruction. It's living, thriving, succeeding in spite of those who tried to silence you. Standing in my garden the next morning, coffee mug in hand, I let the sunlight warm my face. The birds sang overhead, the air smelled of fresh earth, and for the first time in years, coffee tasted exactly as it should, simple, comforting, free of fear. I thought about the long nights in the hospital, the sting of betrayal, the suffocating weight of doubt. Those moments had once felt endless, but now they were part of my past, woven into a story that no longer defined me. Healing doesn't happen overnight. It's not as simple as a verdict or a keynote speech. It's in the small moments, the quiet mornings, the laughter with friends, the steady beat of your own heart reminding you that you're still here. James and Nina chose envy, greed, and deception. I chose survival, resilience, and growth. And every day I live freely, every success I earn honestly is proof that their choices failed. If there's one lesson I carry, it's this: trust yourself. Your instincts are not paranoia, they are warnings. And your voice, no matter how many try to silence it, matters more than you realize. I set down my mug and walked back inside, ready to tackle another day, another challenge, another chance to prove that no betrayal, no poison, no scheme could ever take away the life I had rebuilt with my own strength. Because I survived, and survival in the end is the greatest victory of all.